Hey everybody, happy Friday, welcome back. My name is Garrett Hartle. This is Out Reptiles. And today I have with me a beautiful little 50, oh, peed on me, percent dwarf slayer animal. That's really gross. But here's what I want to do. I want to run you through some numbers really quick and teach you how to calculate dwarf and super dwarf percentages correctly so that you actually know what your animals truly are. We're going to run into the reptile room and you're going to have to put your thinking hats on because I'm going to run through this math pretty quick. You ready? Let's go. So there is a formula to calculate the percentages of these animals. So if you see something like this is 50% SD, maybe it's 62.5% JAMP, what does that all mean? Well, basically it breaks down into the different localities that these animals come from. See, dwarf and superdwarf reticulated pythons are not a genetic mutation per se, like dwarfism in certain other species. They're actually a locality that come from a group of islands in the Flores Sea. So a superdwarf might come from, let's say, the island of Madu, for example. A dwarf might come from the island of Jampea. So when you see something like a dwarf albino, that basically means we took a mainland retic, or a large growing retic, that happened to have a genetic mutation of albino in this case, and was bred into some of the dwarf or super dwarf retics. This works much the same way as if you were to say, hey, I'm half Irish and half Mexican. Or if your grandmother was Mexican, you would be 25% Mexican or 1/4 Mexican. Basically, you're just gonna average together the percentages of the parents for each different locality you're trying to calculate. So let's say we're talking about a Madu superdwarf animal. You're gonna take the percentage of the father, or the sire, you're gonna add that to the percentage of Madu in the mother, or the dam, and then divide by 2. So let's say our first generation, we take a mainland male, so he's 0% Madu, and we breed him to a pure Madu female, 100% pure Madu. We're gonna get 100 divided by 2. All the offspring will be 50% Madu. Now let's say we want to take this a generation farther. You might see that's simple enough to understand. Let's go a little bit more. Let's use this animal now as our new sire. We have a 50% Madu male, and we're going to breed him to, let's say, a pure Madu female again of 100%. Well, when we add these two numbers, we get 150. We divide that by 2 to get the average, and we end up with a 75. In this next case, a 75% superdwarf or Madu locality animal. What would happen if we add like these two strange animals together? I'll give you a second to think about that. If you bred a 50% Madu to a 75% Madu, what percentage Madu are the babies? Got it figured out? 50 plus 75 is going to equal 125, which divided by 2 is 62.5. So in this case, the animal is 62.5% Madu, and so on and so forth. Now, a lot of times you will see animals that are dwarf and super dwarf. You'll see a dwarf and super dwarf cross. For example, I have animals right now, babies, that are 25% Kalatoa, 25% Jampea. Well, all we do is add a separate set of calculations. If this is Madu that we were talking about, which is a super dwarf locality, and we want to add in some Salayar blood, okay? Let's say we took a Slayer to a mainland, a pure one, so you get 50% Slayers, and we bred a 50% Slayer to a 50% Madu. So this animal that's 50% Slayer has no Madu in it, so it's a 0% animal. And then the other parent was, as we said, a 50% Madu, so that's a 50%er. Divide by 2, you get 25% Madu. And on the Slayer side, to calculate the percentage of the Slayer from it, we're going to take our 50% Slayer and breed it to, remember it's a 50% Madu, but that 50% Madu has 0% Slayer in it. So 50 plus 0 is exactly the same calculations. You're going to get 25% and 25%. Now in this case, I have an animal that's 25% dwarf and 25% super dwarf. So what do we call that from a marketing term? Should we call that a super dwarf because it has some super dwarf in it? No, you can't. Technically, you can add this up to get 50% total dwarf and super dwarf blood. But the way that that works is super dwarf percentage can count towards dwarf because a super dwarf is a dwarf, but a dwarf is not a super dwarf. What? Does that even make sense? Yes, it does. If I had an animal like this, I would technically label it as a dwarf animal, but based on its genetic bloodlines, it may stay smaller than your typical dwarf. I could call it a dwarf super dwarf cross, or I could call it a dwarf animal. Dwarf super dwarf cross might be a little bit more specific, but I can't call that a super dwarf. So let's say we threw a couple genetic traits in here. Let's say this was a platy tiger. I can't say that this is a SD platy tiger because it only has 25% super dwarf in it, and the industry standard is something has to be 50% or higher to be labeled as that. So that means if you buy an animal and it's small and it's old, you can't just call that a dwarf. You can't call that a super dwarf. No, you only get dwarfs by breeding into the dwarf locality islands. You get super dwarfs by breeding animals into those super dwarf locality islands. A lot of animals came in labeled as dwarf or super dwarf when they carried a morph with them, like genetic stripe, orange ghost stripe, phantom, golden child, and whether or not that locality data was actually correct for those, the simple fact remains, if I have a golden child that comes in, let's pretend, for the sake of argument, that golden child was a 100% dwarf animal. A lot of times people say golden childs are dwarfs. The original one was 100%, if he was. That golden child was a 100% dwarf, but I bred him into, let's say, an albino to make albino golden childs. Well, that albino that I used, probably 0%. So the resulting golden child head albinos are only going to be 50% dwarf. Now you can call those a dwarf, but if I bred one of those, and this is what happened, the original golden child head albinos, they bred more for morph than for the dwarf, so they bred that GC het albino to a mainland albino. So the resulting animals are the beautiful albino golden childs, but 50 plus 0 is 50 divided by 2. The resulting babies are only 25% dwarf, and those are the first albino golden childs that were ever produced. So those animals are not dwarf because they are not 50% or higher. It's not enough to label them as a dwarf. And if people got them from there and continued to breed them generation after generation for morphs to a 0% animal, that gets divided in half. And then they breed it to another albino, that gets divided in half. You see how this works? And it goes on and on and on and on. So down here is probably the dwarf percentage if the original golden child was actually a dwarf. The animal you have may be 6.25% or even less. So that's not going to be a dwarf animal anymore just because it carries a certain genetic trait with it. If I wanted to raise the amount of percentage in this animal, I would have to breed back to a dwarf to make that small again. I hope that helps. You guys have a great weekend. We will see you right back here for Talk 'em Up Tuesday. Well, I hope you guys had some fun with that. Wait a minute. Why would you have fun with that? That's math. Nobody thinks math is fun. Anyways, I hope that was helpful for you guys and that you have a great weekend. I will catch you right back here next week for Talk 'em Up Tuesday. Take care.